Hey everyone, in this video, let us solve a real SQL interview problem. Now, this was a problem that was shared to me by one of my subscribers called Halesha. Now, before I can solve this problem, first of all, let us try to understand the given data, the problem statement, and then we'll try to solve it. Okay. So basically the problem statement states that we need to find the hierarchy of employees. That is, for each employee, showcase all the employees working under them, including themselves. Okay, and then they have mentioned such that when the child tree expands, that is, every new employee should be dynamically assigned to their managers till the top level hierarchy. Okay, now let us try to understand this based on the data that is given and this graph that is mentioned. Okay, so you can see that I have an input table. It has two columns. There is an employee ID and there is a reporting ID. So this basically means that I have information about 9 different employees. Okay, and then the reporting manager ID is also mentioned here, right? And here in the next table, this is basically the expected output. Okay, now before we understand this, let us understand this graph. So you can see that the top level employee, or basically the root node in this case, is employee ID 1. Okay, probably he is the CEO, so he does not have a manager to whom he is reporting, and that is why his reporting ID is null. Now employee 1 basically manages 2 employees, 2 and 3, and employee 2 manages 2 more employees, that is 2 and 5, and then employee 4 manages 8 and 9. Okay, now similarly employee 3 manages 6 and 7. But if I had to find out all the hierarchy of employees under the employee 1, then basically all of these employees would fall under the employee 1, right? So that means the hierarchy of employees under the employee 1 would basically be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 and 9, right? And that is exactly what you see in the output table here. So for 1, that is for employee ID 1, we have all of these employees listed along with that employee himself. That is because that is mentioned in the problem statement here, that when we are listing the employee hierarchy, we should include the employee himself. Okay, and similarly, if I have to find the hierarchy of employees under 2, I can see that 2 basically manages 4 and 5, but 4 manages 8 and 9. So indirectly or directly, I can tell that the hierarchy of employees under the employee 2 are basically 4, 5, 8 and 9, and that is exactly what is mentioned here. Similarly, for employee 3, I can say that the hierarchy of employees under 3 would be 6 and 7, and then 3 also will be included, and that is exactly what you see here, 3, 6 and 7, and so on and so forth. Okay, so I hope you guys understand the input data, the problem statement, and what we need to do, right? Now, before I can solve this problem, first of all, let us understand what concept of SQL we could generally use to solve this problem, right? Now, in this particular case, the problem statement itself is mentioning hierarchy, and just by looking at this graph, it kind of makes sense that we probably will need to find the hierarchy of some employees or some data, right? Whenever we need to find hierarchy of data, generally the concept that we would use is recursive SQL, right? Now, I think probably we need to use recursive SQL, but just to be double sure, let us just try to analyze the input data and let us try to figure out how we would basically be building a logic to solve this problem. Okay, so basically what we need to do is we need to take one employee at a time, and for each of this employee ID, we need to find a match of that employee ID in the second column, that is in the reporting ID column. Wherever there is a match, we take the corresponding employee ID, and for those employee IDs, in this case 2 and 3, again I try to find a match in the reporting ID column. So I will match it with these 4 records, and hopefully these 4 employee IDs I will get then. And then for these 4 employees, I again do the search in the reporting ID column, right? So what I mean to say is I start with one particular employee ID. I search for that employee ID in the reporting ID column. Then I take the corresponding employee ID, right? Basically, this means these are the employees who are reporting to that particular employee, right? And then I do the similar search for those employees in the reporting ID column. And then I try to fetch the corresponding employee ID. And then I continue to do that execution again and again until I cover all the matches, right? So I will need to execute this query multiple times, right? So whenever we have this kind of a requirement, this basically means that we will need to use recursion. That is, recursively, we will need to execute the query again and again, right? So in order to solve this, now what we'll do is I have already created the input table. As you can see here, it basically has the same input data that was given to us. Okay, now I will be using recursive SQL to solve this problem, and I'm using PostgreSQL database. Of course, you can solve it in any other RDBMS, and recursive SQL, whatever script that you see here, would probably use in other RDBMS as well. Okay, now before I can solve the problem, there would be some people who probably do not know the syntax of how to write a recursive SQL. So for them, I will just tell you how the syntax looks like, and then we will try to actually solve the problem. Okay. Now we are applying recursive SQL using the CT table, that is the with clause. So we start with recursive. This is the mandatory keyword that we need to use. Then we need to give a name to our recursive CT. I'm just going to call it CT, and then the on clause. Okay, sorry, not the on clause, but the as clause. And then I mention the two different queries, right? So first of all is going to be the base query. And then I need to have a union or a union all, any one. And then I need to have the recursive part of the, recursive part of the query, right? And then I need to have my termination or exit condition, right? And finally, at the end, I have my main query, which basically is going to fetch the data from my CT. So this is the syntax of how we can write our recursive SQL. Now, very important thing that you need to know is when the recursive SQL executes in the first iteration, that is, when I say recursive SQL, basically it means that this query will execute multiple times until this condition is met, or the termination condition or the exit condition is met, right? But one thing to remember is in the very first iteration, so when I say iteration, it's basically execution. In the very first execution, or in the very first time this query gets executed, which we call like iteration, only the base query gets executed. Okay, remember that. In the first iteration, only the base query gets executed. And after that, for every subsequent iterations, only the recursive part of the query gets executed. So that means the base query executes only once, and after that, it's only this part of the query that will be executing again and again until the termination condition is met. Now, in order to solve this problem, the very first thing that we will need is what exactly is our base query. Now, when I say base query, it's basically the starting point of our recursion, right? So there should be something based on which the recursion can start. And we know in our case that we need to recursively execute this query starting from each employee ID, right? And we need to do this recursion for each employee ID. So basically our input data or our base query should have access to all of these 9 employee IDs, right? So that's point number one that we can think of. The second point is, if I look at my input data and as per given the requirement, each employee under this employee hierarchy needs to have themselves at least, even if an employee does not have any employees under them, they should still have a mention of themselves under that hierarchy, right? So that is why you see there is 1, 1, there is 2, 2, there is I think 3, 3, there is 4, 4, there is 5, 6, 7, and 8 and 9. These 5 basically are the leaf nodes. So there is no hierarchy of employees under them, but still under this hierarchy table, they have themselves as part of that hierarchy, right? So what I can say is, with this understanding, my base query can be something like I get the list of all the employee IDs, and in the second column, I basically print themselves and I will treat them like an employee hierarchy because I know that has to be in my output, right? With this understanding, what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this query, okay, and I'm going to have my base query something like this, okay. So I'll say select employee ID, comma, employee ID again, but this time I'm going to give an alias for the second column, like let's say employee hierarchy, okay. So if I execute this, you can see that my base query is basically going to have 9 records, 1 record for each employee. In the first column, I have the employee ID itself. In the second column, I again have the same employee ID, but I'm calling it like employee hierarchy because that is as per my expected output. Okay. So I have basically got a part of my output already. Now what I need to do is for each of these employee, I need to try to match them in the reporting ID column and see what other employees are reporting to this employee, right? Recursively, I need to do that, right? So that part we will do it in the recursive part of the query. Now, in order to do that, let us understand what we need. So when this query gets executed, the base query will get executed. This is kind of going to be our input, right? So in the second iteration, this is going to be the input, right? And here I can see I have employee ID, and again, I have employee ID here. But what my intention is, so let's say in order to get started, or whenever we are trying to solve a problem, it's always better that instead of solving the problem for the entire input data, we just take one sample record, okay, and based on that we build the logic, and then once everything is working, then we remove that filter and apply that logic for all the data, okay. So here, just to make it simple, I'm just going to take one employee at a time. So I'll say employee ID equal to 1, okay. So my base query is going to have data just for one employee, that is my employee ID 1. Okay. Then what I need to do is for each of this employee, I go and find that employee under the reporting ID column of the employee hierarchy table. So this employee hierarchy is kind of like my input table, right? So here in my base query, I will get the employee ID as 1 for each, and now I'm choosing 1, but at the final query, I'll have basically all the employees. And for each of this employee ID, I will need to go into my employee hierarchy table, that is my input table, and I need to find them in the reporting ID. So in this case, 1 will probably get matched here, and I will get this 2 and 3. And this 2 and 3, then I should take again in the third iteration, I should take this 2 and 3 and try to find it here, right? This is my logic, right? So with this understanding, what I'm going to do is I'm going to write my recursive part of the query here. I'm just going to say select from CT. Of course, I will need to use CT here because that is how I'm going to make this query recursive, right? And I will need to join it with my master table in this case. That is my employee hierarchy or my input table, right? And I'm going to give an alias for this like EH, right? So what I want, this CT table is going to have just my base query, that in this case, it's only having the employee ID 1. I want to join this employee ID 1. I'll just tell on that is cte.emp ID is equal to, I want to join it with the employee hierarchy table under the column reporting ID, right? So this 2 records gets matched, right? So I'm just going to say eh.reporting ID. Okay. I'm just getting started with this. Let's see if this works. If it does not work, we'll see how we can fix it. Okay. So I think if we can do this in the first iteration, this 1 will match with these 2 records. Hopefully in the second iteration, it will take 2 and 3 as the input and it will try to match it here. Then I will get in the third iteration these 4, and these 4 will then be taken and try to match based on the reporting ID here, and hopefully the recursion should work. Okay, this is my initial understanding. Let's see what happens. So I'm just going to execute this. Okay, first of all, I missed the select statement or select clauses here. So here I need to have my cte.employee ID. Okay, so this is my employee ID, and then okay, so this will be my employee ID, in this case employee ID 1, and then from this employee hierarchy table, so what happens is I will probably match these 2 records for this one, and I need to take this 2 and 3, which is kind of going to be my employee hierarchy, right? So this 2 and 3 is coming under the employee ID column of my employee hierarchy table. So what I'm going to say eh.emp ID, okay, but this is going to be have an alias like employee underscore hierarchy, right? I hope you understand this. What am I doing? I'm joining this employee ID 1 with the reporting ID column here, but I'm taking this data 2 and 3, that is the employee ID from the employee hierarchy table, and I'm calling it like employee hierarchy column. Okay, I hope this is clear. Now let's execute this, and I have executed this, but you can see that it's like it's basically gone into an infinite loop. Okay, so this means something is wrong in my recursive SQL query. So this is a common problem that can happen whenever you are using recursion. If something is wrong with your termination condition or with your select clauses, then you can get into infinite loop. Now we will need to fix this, but first of all, let us kill this query. I'm just going to terminate this query here by clicking on this button. Now I have cancelled that statement, and now let's try to fix this. Now, if you have ever used recursive SQL, you would probably have come across this kind of problem where your query gets into infinite. Basically, it keeps on executing without basically coming out, right? Now, whenever this kind of things happen, it's very important to know how you can debug recursive SQL queries. And that is what I want to show you in this particular video. So in order to properly explain you how internally this recursive SQL query works, I'm going to tell you what is the SQL query that SQL actually executes in each of the iteration. Based on that, we will try to see in which iteration the problem is happening, and then we will try to see how we can fix this. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to call this like first iteration. I'm going to see what is a query that SQL executes in the first iteration. Okay. And then I will see in the second iteration, third iteration, and so on and so forth. Okay. So here I'll say second iteration, third iteration, and then we'll see if we'll need any other iterations to understand the problem. Okay. Now, whenever I execute this query, internally what happens is in the first iteration, SQL will only execute the base query. Anything that is above union is the base query. Anything below union is our recursive part of the query. So in the first iteration, only the base query gets executed. So what I'll do here, I'll just put my base query. Okay. And if I just execute this, you can see that I am getting the input data. That is my first iteration data. That looks fine. There is no issue in this. Okay. Now let's see in the second iteration what happens when this query is executed. In the first iteration, base query gets executed. Then SQL goes into the second iteration. In the second iteration, SQL does not even bother looking at this. Okay. SQL will only execute the second part of this query. That is the recursive part of the query. Okay. So I'll just put this here. But the thing that you need to remember here, in this particular query, that is the recursive part of the query, we have something called as CTE. Now this CTE is basically going to have the data from the previous iteration. Okay. Now since we are in the second iteration, this CTE is going to have the data from the first iteration. And the first iteration data was basically this query, right? So what I'll do, I'll just put this query, this entire query here. Okay. And I'll just move this to the right just to make it neat. Okay. So this is the output of my first iteration, which will be kind of used by my CTE when I come to the second iteration. Okay. Now when I execute this whole query, this is kind of what happens internally during the second iteration of this recursive SQL query. I hope this is clear, and I think the data that we are getting is also fine. So we are looking for only one employee, that is employee 1, and we are getting the hierarchy as 2 entry, and we know that is exactly what was there in our input table. So we had employee ID 1 that we got in base query. Then we had this for employee ID 1, the hierarchy of employees were 2 and 3 because 2 and 3 were reporting to 1, right? Now in the third iteration, ideally what should happen is I should take this 2 and 3 and I should match it with the reporting ID column here, and hopefully my output should be something like this 4, 5, 6, 7. Okay. Now let us see if that is actually happening or not. So first of all, when I'm going to my third iteration, again what I do, SQL is only going to execute this second part of the query, the recursive part of the query. So I'm just going to copy that and I'm just going to put it here. Okay, so just to make it neat, I'll leave an additional line, and this is my query. I'll move this to the left. Now the thing that you need to remember is in the third iteration, the CTE is going to have the output from the second iteration. So this whole query that we used in the second iteration kind of becomes my CTE in the third iteration, right? So I'm just going to put that here and I will move this to the right. Now let me execute this. Hopefully my output should be 4, 5, 6, 7. If that's not the case, then probably we are doing something wrong. Okay, so let me execute this, and you can see that I am getting the data. It's not going into any infinite loop or something, but the problem is the data does not look right. Ideally, my employee hierarchy here should have been 4, 5, 6, 7, something like that we saw, right? Definitely not 2, 3, 2, 3, right? So let us understand what exactly is happening. Now, I'm just going to execute what we had in our CT. So in CT, I had 2 and 3, right? So if I go back to my employee hierarchy table, I got base query, I got this employee 1. In my first iteration, I got this 1, 1 and 2, 3, right? In my in my third iteration, I had to take this 2 and 3, match it with all the records in this reporting ID column, and I should have got 4, 5, 6, 7, right? But I'm not getting this, right? Let's see why am I not getting this. So what is it that I'm doing wrong? So here I'm getting 2 and 3 from the CT. Okay, and that 2 and 3, okay, if I execute that again, so this 2 and 3 is under the column employee hierarchy, and this is basically my CTE, right? So I should have joined my CTE.employee hierarchy with the reporting ID column of the employee hierarchy table, right? But I think I'm using a wrong column here, right? So if you see again here, what am I getting? I'm getting 2 and 3 under the employee hierarchy column, but I'm joining with the employee ID column of the CTE table. So I'm basically joining 1 with the reporting ID again. I have already joined 1 in my second iteration here. So ideally here I should have taken 2 and 3 and tried to join it in the reporting ID column. Okay, which I'm not doing. So I think there is a problem here. I'm using the wrong column to do the joining. So let me try to fix this. So what I'll do, I'll copy the employee hierarchy. I'll put it here. And now let me execute this. And I think now I'm getting the correct data. So now I'm getting the proper hierarchy of employees who are under 1. Okay, or basically I would say who are working under 2 and 3. Okay, so I think this was the problem that we had. We were using a wrong column to join. Okay, now instead of again explaining the other iterations, let's see by doing this change, does our original query work? If it does not work, then we'll again try to debug with the next set of iterations. Okay, so the only change that we did was we just replaced employee ID joining with the employee hierarchy joining, right? So let's see if that works. I hope I have taken the proper column. Okay, and let me execute this. And I think it is working. You can see that for employee 1, now I'm getting 9 records and I'm having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay. So, and if I look at my data for 1, these were all the 9 employees that should have been under the hierarchy, right? I'm getting that. Now let's see if I just change the input to 2, does it work? Okay. So for 2, I am getting, there are 2, 4, 5, 8, 9. Okay. So for 2, I have 4, 5, 8, 9. So looks like it's working fine. Now let's see for 3 if it is having the proper data. So for 3, I'm getting 3 will be there by default. That is basically themselves. Then I have 6 and 7 under them, right? So 6 and 7. Okay. So looks like my query is basically working. So I'll remove this filter and now I'll execute it for all the employees. Okay. And you can see that I'm getting 25 records and I think it is not sorted properly. So just to sort it properly, I'm just going to say order by emp id comma employee hierarchy. Okay. So employee id comma employee hierarchy. And if I execute this now you can see that I'm having 1 to 9 here. For 2, I'm having, I think 2, 4, 5, 8, 9, which is right. For 3, I'm having 3, 6, 7, which is right. For 4, I'm having 4, 8, and 9. Let's see that 4, 8, and 9, which looks fine. And then for 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, basically they don't have any employees under them. So they are just having themselves. And that is exactly what we have here. Right? So this is basically the solution to the problem. I hope you understood this problem, understood the solution, and you also understood how I debugged a recursive SQL query, how I came up with different queries that SQL internally uses for iteration, and understanding that we were able to realize the problem that we are doing and then we try to fix it. Okay. Hopefully this query helped. If you liked this video, definitely leave a feedback in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching and see you soon in the next one. Bye.